Hey, my name is Newt Kash Shelter. I'm an archaeologist, and this channel is dedicated to the archaeology of North America, especially the region that we call the Eastern Woodlands. So my last video was a synopsis of a paper that Laura Humsey Messer wrote a few years ago about the role of rock shelters and caves in the Archaic period and kind of a reassessment of what we think those sites are being used for. And that reminded me of this paper by Cheryl Claassen that I think goes along with it really well. Now, Newt Kash Shelter was excavated back in 1935, and frankly, because it was excavated so long ago, it's kind of a marvel that we can actually use it to say much of anything, given the changes in, well, the improvements in standards of excavation and recording since then. This site is best known for having a lot of very early examples of what are called the Eastern Agricultural Complex crops. So things like goosefoot and sumpweed and sunflower. And these, date to the late Archaic period. Claassen gives a date of about 4,000 years ago. And as the title of the paper implies, she thinks that this shelter was mostly used by women. She says in the abstract, quote, Newt Kash may have been a woman's retreat place during menstruation, birthing, sickness, and possibly the meeting place for a medicine society. Okay, so disclaimer on Claassen. I love reading her work because she reads a lot of ethnography from all over North America, from Mexico up into Canada, and her papers and books are just festooned with these interesting little tidbits of information that you're not likely to get anywhere else unless you're reading the same sources that she is. And she makes some really important and interesting observations and connects some dots that a lot of other archaeologists overlook. But she also has a tendency to make some claims that are very speculative and conflate things that as equivalent that shouldn't be put together, really. So you have to read her work with a certain amount of suspicion and take it with a grain of salt. And I'll point out some of those issues as we go along. So first, the shelter itself. This is not a karst limestone cave like we have at places like Dust Cave or Russell Cave. This is a sandstone bluff, and it is kind of a cavity in a bluff that overlooks the Red River Gorge area of eastern Kentucky. It's over 200 feet long. It is as deep as 55 feet deep. Yeah. So there's plenty of space to do things inside this shelter. Nuts like hickory and chestnuts were found in large numbers, and that shouldn't be surprising to anyone who saw that last video. And there are also 2 bedrock mortars within the space. And a bedrock mortar is really just a boulder that has these cup-shaped indentions ground into them from repeated processing and grinding and pulverizing of, in many cases, these mast resources like the hickory and the chestnut and the acorn that I've talked about before. And also, like I said, we've got the Eastern Agricultural Complex crops like the sumpweed and the goosefoot and the sunflower, as well as later imports like flint corn and certain squashes. And also tobacco seeds. The corn does imply that there were some later occupations and utilizations of these sites, and that may be confusing things a little bit. It's really hard to tell just by reading this paper. So Claassen says, along with the seeds, wood, and nuts, the crew encountered hundreds of pieces of fabric, string, and cordage. Caches of textiles were found in several places. Several beds made out of woven pawpaw fibers, as well as matted big blue stem grass and leaves, were found just below the floor surface in the shelter. When they were unfolded, moccasins, leaves, nuts, bone, antler, wooden items, strips of leather, strings, cords, and bags fell out. Excavators also found a cradleboard, which, if you've never seen one of those before, it's an indigenous tool that indigenous people traditionally used to swaddle newborn babies. And they spend a lot of time in these things until they are big enough to walk. Now, near the cradleboard, there were 3 items that were attached to pieces of string. One was the leg of a fetal deer, including the hoof, a deer's tooth, and a piece of bracket fungus, which if you ever seen like turkey tail mushroom, that's what they're talking about. That kind of a mushroom fungus. And it is thought that these items were attached to the cradleboard in the same kind of way that we put like mobiles over kids' cribs today, to entertain them generally. They also might have been a form of like protective magic or something like that. But I think that's a fairly reasonable, at least, speculation. The stuff isn't directly dated because of how old the excavations are. There are a few dates from it directly, but not as many as there would be if we had excavated this, 5-10 years ago. But the artifacts do tend to point in a late Archaic to early woodland kind of direction. She mentions limestone tempered pottery that's plain and court marked. And she gives a date range of 3,200 to about 1,000 years ago, which that's the entire woodland period. That's not the early woodland period, but knowing what I do about this region, the limestone tempered pottery with the plain ware and the cord marking, that ties into a pretty broad range of woodland period material cultures. So I think that putting the early in there is based more on some other information that she's going to talk about in a bit. It could also just be a typo. So other better dated bluff shelters in this same region within the this Red River Gorge area, near to Newt Kash. The big storage pits that they're finding in Newt Kash, they find similar ones, and they're all dating to no earlier than the early woodland period. So they don't show up in the Archaic. At Cloud Splitter Shelter, they got some squash seeds that were dated to between 6,000 and 4,800 years ago. So that's also, a late Archaic date range, very late Archaic date range. And she used that to suggest that the squash seeds that were found at Newt Kash were not later depositions from, late woodland or Mississippian time periods. That these are actually from the Archaic or early woodland, which that holds up. That makes sense, perfect sense. You also get Chenopodium dates that have come from the 4,000 to 3,300 range. That's late Archaic, right up against that early woodland, and then there are also early woodland dates that have come back. So the idea that these are predominantly a late Archaic, early woodland phenomenon in this particular gorge area seems fairly reasonable. We don't know what information she's leaving out, though. There might be plenty of indication that there was habitation in these sites before, during, and after the time period that she's talking about. Now, historically, the combination of these food storage pits, the bedding, the textiles, and all of this have been interpreted to suggest that Newt Kash was a habitation site, it was a base camp, basically. But Claassen thinks otherwise. The first thing she mentions is that there's a high variation in animal remains, like in terms of species, but there aren't very many animals there in general. And that is a foraging and trapping pattern. That's like an opportunistic thing. Hunters tend to go after big, meaty animals. They're targeting specific species like deer and turkeys. So if we've got whole communities living here, and those whole communities have people who hunt deliberately instead of opportunistically, we should be seeing a lot of deer and a lot of turkey and just bigger, meatier animals, and that we don't see at Newt Kash, which suggests to Claassen that men aren't there. The opportunistic trapping pattern is common among, men, women, and children, but is more leaning towards women and children. You also don't get a whole lot of like masculine coded material culture at the shelter. There are very few spear points or projectiles or anything like that. Most of the activity that we see represented has to do with textile production from plants like pawpaw and Indian hemp and milkweed, which in most indigenous cultures, textile manufacturing is a woman's craft. It's something that's taught mother to daughter. Women are doing this. Men aren't really involved with it too much, except maybe for gathering the raw materials for the manufacture of the textiles. The fact that there are plenty of women's activities represented here and very few men's activities represented makes Claassen think that this is mostly being occupied by women in the being secluded from men. And this is where Claassen really starts to Claassen, because she starts talking about notice that the first thing she talks about is this Mesoamerican goddess named Tlazaleatl. Notice the cut there. Who was the goddess of weaving, childbirth, and sex. There's also some talk about how the Cherokee connect baskets with women who are the sources of both food and life. Women are the sources of food because not only do their bodies produce breast milk, but also in their society they are the primary farmers and the primary harvesters of those crops. And so just like the seeds are stored in and then come out of the basket, and children are stored in and then come out of the physical bodies of women, so that's kind of the connection that symbolically is being made there. She also talks about how certain Osage women get tattoos of spiders on the backs of their hands, and spiders are like nature's weavers. So all cool little tidbits that she's using to illustrate how indigenous women all over North America are associated with the craft of textile production. The next section is about nut oil production, which I talked about in the last video. So just to recap, you collect a whole lot of hickory nuts, chestnuts, things like that. You crush them up, you put them in water, you boil the water, the oils rise to the surface, they can be skimmed off and used. And typically this is discussed in terms of food, because these nuts are very high in fats and calories and nutrients. But Claassen's pointing out that it's not just about food. So you also use these oils in the polishing of bone tools and ornaments and wood implements and things like that. You can use it as a binder to make paint. You can use it to treat leather. And she also makes the claim that their primary function is as a toiletry item for the treatment of skin and hair care, sort of in the same vein as like lotions and hair conditioners. And while I do think it is a bit bogus to argue that they're producing this massive amount of hickory nut oil, mostly just for skin and hair care, I think it does serve as a strong reminder that we're dealing with human beings here, and they have quality of life concerns beyond just food concerns. So it's a lot of different needs are being satisfied by these resources. So at this point, she asks rhetorically, why come to Newt Kash specifically to weave and make oil? Why not do that back at base camp? And to answer that question, she turns back to Mexico again. She gives a couple of citations of this belief in Mexico that people's body temperature fluctuates depending on their kind of state of health, and their states of activity and so on, which, fair enough. Two of these states are during menstruation and pregnancy. And there's also apparently the idea that this built up body heat escapes through the eyes. And so the gaze of these women who are menstruating and pregnant she almost makes it sound like they have death ray vision or something like that it can be harmful to people and plants and animals. And so she's arguing that in order to not cause harm to her own community, a woman in one of these two states of health would go into seclusion in Kentucky. Not women from Mexico doing this, but she's arguing that this belief also exists in southern Appalachia and is not exclusive to Mexico. Now, do I think that applying this reported ancient belief from Mexico to archaic people in Kentucky who lived thousands of years earlier than the people being discussed in Mexico, is the basis for a sound argument. No, I don't. She's conflating two groups of people that don't have any there's no real good connection between these two places and beliefs. Now, closer to home, she's got some better information that does appear that women going into seclusion for during menstruation and during pregnancy and shortly thereafter, postpartum, that was practiced in the Southeast during, the contact period, and after, in the 1800s is when a lot of these ethnohistories get written. But is there any indication that it's because they're going to damage the crops or whatever with their death ray vision? No. It's just going into seclusion during menstruation is just apparently a fairly common practice in the eastern woodlands among people like the Choctaw and the Chickasaw and the Muskogee and the Delaware and various other groups of people. Claassen's also going to point out that there are a lot of medical plants, like medicinal plants, in these shelters, and there are reportedly several gynecological applications for some of these plants. It's also the case that if you look at the burials from these shelters, they're mostly women and infants when we can get biological sex estimates on them at all. So there's something to it for sure. So now we have to talk about the R word, because Claassen also talks about Newt Kash Shelter as being the site of ritual activities. And before I get into all that, I have to point out that archaeologists do not use the word ritual the same way that normal people use the word ritual. For an archaeologist, the mantelpiece above your fireplace is a ritual space because you put family photos there, you don't store your toilet paper on it. And your dining room table is a ritual space because you eat meals there, you don't store your power tools on it when you're not using them. But in this case, Claassen is arguing that Newt Kash Shelter was where the practitioners of a sacred women's medical society, a medicine society, this is where they congregated. How did she get there? It's all about the pits. So if you look at this map, there's a row of 8 pits along the back wall. And they're all different sizes, but they're roughly evenly spaced. And that row is not oriented this way for any prosaic functional reason, according to Claassen, but because people's actions are most structured, habitual, and bound by rules in the course of ritual. To which I can only say, what the crackhead hell is that argument? So you've got a line of pits that are roughly evenly distributed along a back wall, and that's evidence. No, not nearly good enough. There's also a second cluster constellation of pits that make sort of a cross shape that she's calling a quincunx, and she says that this shape has been associated with the creation of the earth for almost 2,000 years, and B, the Aztec associated the number 5 with women dying in childbirth. The problem with statement A is that she doesn't say who associates that shape with the creation at all. Like which group of people, which groups of people. The problem with statement B is that whoever is occupying these bluff shelters in Kentucky, 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, they were not Aztec. Aztec beliefs about these things do not play in to this at all. That is not acceptable evidence for the claim that she's trying to make. And the problem with both of them is that this is a cluster of 6 pits, not 5. So I don't think that argument holds up to scrutiny at all. Finally, there's a group of 3 over there on the right that are surrounded by 15 posts. And this arrangement is separated from the second arrangement, the quincunx, the non-quincunx, by 2 boulders, which she said could have been used as altars or benches for offerings, ritual objects, idols, or individuals staging a ritual. I would point out that they could also be none of those things. Uh, as it turns out, there was an infant burial that was placed in between the two of them, and there was a similar situation at another site called Samson Spencer Shelter, where an infant was also buried in between two slabs. Is all of this evidence that there was an early woodland infant sacrifice ritual practiced by a women's medical society? No, probably not at all. Um, and this is kind of what I mean when, like, she's gonna say some stuff, and the evidence that she provides for it is not always. Uh, it's often making huge leaps in order to get to where she wants it to go. So that's really all she's got for this alleged women's medicine society, is that she thinks they had one. And that's about it. Um, Now, she does go on to make some other interesting observations, and kind of puts forward some food for thought. If these bluff shelters were being occupied by women who are menstruating and pregnant, and these women are coming from communities that think that they have the power to contaminate, food and things like that, when they are in these states of health. And we also are finding these early Eastern agricultural complex crops all over the place in these bluff shelters. Does it make more sense for them to be dragging these crops up to the bluff shelters with them, or does it make more sense for them to be growing them nearby? And if that's what they're doing, and they are planting and reaping these crops and stashing them there throughout the year, then it may be that the impetus for domesticating these crops in the first place was as a reliable and storable food resource for women who are going off by themselves to these bluff shelters, for a few days every month. And if that's the case, it may be that these foodstuffs were never intended for the general community to be consuming at all. She also points out that, like, in a lot of indigenous societies in the Southeast, at least, food and medicine are basically the same thing. And so these particular foods might have been thought to have particular medical benefits for women who are menstruating or pregnant. And so they're planting these things deliberately, for the health of women in these states of health, that in these phases of life, really. And then that is what gets the ball rolling and gets them to be domesticated after, several hundred years. It's an interesting idea, but do remember that back when I was talking about Salt's Cave, where they took the human fecal samples and tested them for testosterone and estrogen, they're way elevated in testosterone. These are men shitting in that cave, not women, and they're full of these Eastern agricultural complex crops. So it's an interesting idea that she's putting forward here. I don't think it actually matches what we see in the archaeological record in terms of it does look like everyone's eating these Eastern agricultural complex crops. It's not just women, or even just menstruating women. So this video might be kind of confusing for people because some of her arguments seem pretty solid. Some of them seem pretty ridiculous. Some of them, there's this gray area where her conclusions are supported by some of her evidence and not supported by other evidence. And it can be really hard to tease out which parts are trustworthy information and which parts aren't. And if that makes you uncomfortable, good. That's the point. I get a lot of people, not a lot of people, I get several people in my comments talking about how archaeologists are all just kind of brainwashed by whatever, like, official story our professors hand down to us on high, which is kind of hilarious to me because the professors barely talk, especially in grad school. Most of those classes is we read about 500 pages a week of material like this. This paper is only about 16 pages, by the way. And then we have to show up to class and talk about what parts make sense, what parts don't make sense, and then be able to defend those arguments against other people in class who might really disagree with us. So having to go through a paper like this is really much more what it's like to be working on an archaeological degree. It's a little bit bewildering sometimes. I would say that if I were going into class having to talk about this paper, I would say that the claim that some of these rock shelters, not all of them, but some of them, in the late Archaic, early woodland kind of time period, were special places used primarily by women. I think that argument is solid. Were those specifically pregnant and menstruating women? I think that given the absence of normal hunted foodstuffs and the presence of the bedding and the absence of specifically masculine coded artifacts or burials, I think that there is something to it, and I think it does make a lot of sense, especially ethnographically when we know that people in the Southeast, women are going into seclusion, in the 1800s or whatever, during these times of their life. So I think it's plausible. I think it makes a certain amount of sense. What about her ritual medicine societies? If she's right about that, I think it is pure dumb luck. It's just a really lucky guess because the evidence that she's using to make that claim is wildly non sequitur. There's really no science to it. And Cheryl can go way into left field on this kind of stuff. Like when I was younger and doing my field school, we were doing one of the sites that we were working on was a rock shelter, and she came out because she wanted to see if she could find patches of period blood on the wall somewhere, which it's southern Appalachia. It's foggy and misty and humid, and there are all kinds of processes. They're going to wash that thing right off in a very short amount of time, especially when you're not back in the dark zones of caves. But the thing is, like, Claassen's the only person who would even think to look for it, and this is why I recommend people read Cheryl Claassen, is that she forces us to ask very different questions archaeologically than most of us are used to. She draws attention to certain patterns that she's seeing that often get ignored otherwise. And she also forces us to think about archaeological people in terms of communities that are built of a whole range of ages and genders and social statuses, especially pointing out how the lives of young women were likely very different from the lives of everyone else in society, in their communities. And those kinds of observations are really important, and they're important for us to keep in mind when we are, looking at archaeological sites and looking at evidence. Even if sometimes some of Claassen's conclusions can be more than a little bit silly. So that's all I've got for this one. I look forward to reading your questions and comments down below. And as always, thank you for watching.